Welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love history, travel, food, and finding out how people live and what makes them tick. I've been traveling for over half a century as time, finances, and circumstances permit. I only once ever had a truly bad experience as a rather naive rising college junior on my first trip to Europe, right here in Madrid back in 1970. At the time, Spain was still a hideously repressive dictatorship controlled by a bunch of right-wing authoritarians and the military. A lot of things were not allowed. When a group of people is repressed to that extent, they find things they are allowed to do and they do them. Sexual assault happens to be one of those things. A tall, long-legged, young blonde woman, obviously not Spanish and lost, seemed to be an easy target for them. And that day I really was lost and tired. It was in the middle of the day, too, not in the dark of night. I did what is often suggested when a person is confused. I got into a cab. This turned out to be a huge mistake. I gave the driver the address of my cheap hotel. It was something close to the old Atocha station, since it's always been my habit to stay near a major transportation hub, and in those days there were no subways. The greasy cab driver turned around, looked at me, muttered something about Niña perdida, it means lost little girl, and tried to grope my leg. I keel-hauled the creep from the back of the seat, jumped out of the cab, figured out where I was, and hightailed it back to the hotel. The next day, I left Spain and didn't go back for half a century. 50 years is a long time to hold a grudge. I decided to give Madrid a second chance. Mostly, I decided to stay here because of the opportunities for day trips outside of town. But along the way, to and fro, I discovered a vastly improved and fascinating city to visit. With all that as a little background, let's take a look today with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide at the glorious capital of Spain, Madrid. The Iberian Peninsula today consists mostly of Spain and Portugal, although before the unification of the kingdom included several independent kingdoms and duchies, shown in the map on the left. The region is known for its diverse landscapes, ranging from beautiful islands, to this day an enormous draw for sun-seeking tourists, coastlines, and rugged mountains. Today, Spain has a rich cultural history that was fused from contributions by the various contributing civilizations, not just those you see listed on the map, but also including the Imperial Romans and the Moors. As you can see in the geographic map on the right, a great deal of this peninsula consists of an enormous inland plateau. The peninsula actually benefited from geographic isolation. To the northeast were the Pyrenees. The rest of the northern area was pretty much isolated by the Bay of Biscay, to this day the bane of seasick-prone cruise travelers, especially during the winter months. To the west was the broad Atlantic. To the south was the meeting place of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, where Spain meets Africa, separated only by the Straits of Gibraltar. Indigenous peoples were here since the time of the Neanderthals. Later on, parts of the peninsula were conquered and sparingly settled by the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Visigoths, who had worked their way south from the Pyrenees, and the Moors, who came north from Africa. The Moors were responsible for establishing a stronghold here in what is now called Madrid. During a 200-year and more long campaign, the various kingdoms united and eventually succeeded in pushing the Muslims off the peninsula. Ferdinand II of Aragon had married Isabel of Castile and united much of the north, better known to us Americans for financing Columbus's voyages to what was supposed to be India. It turned out that he discovered North America. The two played a crucial role in the campaign, called the Reconquista, to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. All of that ended with the fall of Granada to the Christian forces in 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella eventually set up shop in what had been the site of a Moorish fortification, called an Alcazar, right here in Madrid. Sometimes the easiest way to begin a visit is in the heart of the city, and Puerta del Sol, shown here, is Madrid's beating heart. The square actually owes its existence to a Spanish king named Carlos III, or Charles III, who is sometimes called the best mayor Madrid ever had. The story happened like this. In the early days, there was a city wall with a gate by that name located right here. Carlos was born in Madrid and gets credit for actually modernizing the city. By the time he appeared on the scene, this was a full-blown medieval city with all of the negative things that can mean. Carlos was part of a line stretching back to Philip II, or Felipe II, to use his Spanish name, who moved his capital here in 1561. I think Philip did that reluctantly. Despite over 200 years of occupation, or perhaps because of it, Madrid lacked amenities. There was no proper sewage system, no city lighting, which promoted organized crime, no organized trash collection. Think about New York City during a sanitation workers' strike, except no plastic bags and a lot hotter, winding narrow streets and no public services, not even a postal system. No clean water supply, no public transportation, nothing. Carlos changed all of that during the 3 decades in which he was king. He introduced street lighting, a working sewage system, and rubbish collection. He commissioned the bullfighting ring and the royal palace, which we'll visit later in the next walk. He was responsible for building the square that we see today. 20th century Spain was a country with serious economic problems. Madrid, like the rest of the country, was laboring with a recession, high unemployment. It peaked at around 22% in 2011. A banking crisis and austerity measures by the government designed to control expenses, but which mostly slashed public services, infrastructure construction and maintenance, and social programs. Infrastructure was essentially allowed to run downhill, perhaps under the foolish impression that once it was built, maintenance wasn't necessary, or that if it was, it should be paid out of income. Neither of these things are true. The Madrid subway system was in particularly bad condition. In 2015, when I floated through, subway tunnels and walkways were studded with buckets to catch runoff from the rain. The city fathers went looking around for money, and they found it in a somewhat surprising place. Cell phones are far more common than landlines in Madrid. The younger riders particularly use them, but a surprising number of seniors can be found reading their mail and chit-chatting, somewhat annoyingly, inside the trains. Somebody had to provide that service. Vodafone and Movistar compete for the top spot in the country. Perhaps looking to expand its presence in Madrid, in 2013, Vodafone signed a 3-year agreement with the Madrid Metro, which allowed it to rename Line 2 as the Vodafone Line and the central Sol station, shown here as Vodafone Sol. This is an enormous interchange that connects Line 2 with Lines 1 and 3, and it's a key hub for passengers traveling through the city. The deal was worth $3 million over 3 years, significantly boosting Madrid's metro advertising by 10% annually. It was a welcome chunk of change for the cash-strapped system. Advertising income meant that the system was able to do some serious maintenance. Whether this paid off for Vodafone or not, I cannot say, but I do know it was good for the Madrid Metro. After the 3-year agreement ended in 2016, the Madrid Metro and Vodafone did not renew the naming rights deal. The names of the lines reverted to their old names. Madrid Metro has continued to look for new sponsorship opportunities to generate additional income, but as far as I know, no one has been willing to take over the naming rights. This enormous square comes complete with history and some rather unusual decorations. When you enter the square, you meet up with a somewhat larger than life-size bronze bear, apparently clawing down strawberries from a tree. This statue is called Oso y Madrono. It's the official symbol of Madrid and a popular meeting spot. It certainly makes a great landmark. The statue only dates from 1967, although the story behind it is as old as Madrid itself. The bear is said to represent strength and courage, while the strawberry tree symbolizes the city's pastures and forests, or at least those that were here a long time ago. Those trees are the source of a fruit that looks a little bit like a strawberry and is used to make Madrono honey. The bear, the tree, and the fruit all appear in both the statue and in the city flag shown here. The square also features a rather nice equestrian statue of Carlos III, commemorating his contributions to the development of the city. Like the honey bear, this statue is practically brand new. It only dates from 1994. Charles's rule dates back to 1759, so you might be wondering why it took them so long to put up the memorial. It turns out that this is a replica of an earlier statue. The idea for a statue had been floating around for a very long time, but getting the money and settling on the design required a lot of squabbling and fighting. In the 17th century, there were more than 30 two-story buildings shoved into this site. A big city square like this one is always going to be a magnet for government buildings, and one of them is the first city post office, shown here. This sign, Calle de Posta, with a horse-drawn mail cart, was meant to steer the non-literate citizens of Madrid, as well as confused tourists, in the right general direction. The building itself is called the Palacio de Comunicaciones, and it's home of the regional government of Madrid. There's still a post office in the building. This building looks more modern than some parts of the city, and it should. It only dates from 1907, long after Charles' time on the throne. It's a combination of Gothic revival and Art Deco fusion. If you visited Gaudi's Barcelona with me in an earlier video blog, you may remember that Catalan modern style included elements of both Gothic revival and Art Deco, but it looked very different from this one. The clock tower actually converts the square, at least at midnight on December 31st, into Madrid's version of Times Square. At midnight, the party hardy, or maybe just insomniacs, gather here to wait for the clock to strike 12. In front of the main post office is Mile Zero, the symbolic center of Spain, pointing in the general direction of an enormous El Corte Inglés department store just beyond the square. Sadly, the post office building has a much darker side. Part of it used to house Franco's police headquarters, where the Guardia Civil rounded up his enemies for further processing. No one knows how many people were killed here, and we don't even know all the names, although I did read they estimate around 3,000 citizens, many of them perhaps processed here, were eventually murdered at the cemetery behind the cathedral, which we'll visit in our next walk. And as for this headquarters, well, an amazing number of Franco's prisoners escaped by jumping out of its windows to their deaths. Like all of Western Europe, Spain is wary of terrorists, and with good reason. The police presence, while not nearly as oppressive as I remember from my 1970 visit, is still here and quite obvious. Notice this guard, looking alert and not at all bored. He's obviously paying attention to what's going on around him. That sidearm he's toting may not be a machine gun, but it certainly isn't just decorative. I found the odd-shaped hats even more interesting. The story goes the flat part, in back, allowed an officer to lean against the building without damaging his hat, perhaps when he was taking a smoke break. Above the officer's head to the left is a memorial to those killed in Spain's own version of 9/11, in this case 3/11/2004. The Madrid subway and train stations were the general target. A series of coordinated bombings on commuter trains killed 192 people and injured 2,000 right here in the city. The attack was actually carried out by an Islamic extremist group linked to Al-Qaeda. This rather new sign commemorates the victims of that attack. It reads, "Madrid is grateful to all of those who knew how to fulfill their duty in helping the victims of the 2004 attacks and all the anonymous citizens who helped them. May the memory of the victims and the exemplary behavior of the people of Madrid always remain." My guidebook told me that this, one of the oldest squares in the city, got its name because it was the main square. That's true, but it's actually a little bit misleading. The main square today is the Puerta del Sol. Like a much-married woman, the area around here had several names, and the term Plaza Mayor only dates from the end of the Spanish Civil War. They never changed it after that. This lovely square actually reminds me a bit of the Place de Vosges in Paris, shown on the left. This isn't completely surprising, as they were built within a couple of decades of one another. Each has a completely enclosed square with entrances for carriages, cars now, and a covered colonnade all the way around, as well as an empty area in the center. Each square is surrounded on all four sides by multi-story buildings with ground floors composed mostly, these days, of restaurants and bars. Although most of the ground floor shops do seem to be restaurants and bars, the upstairs is another matter. Several of the buildings contain apartments and condos. You're going to pay a premium to live here as you would in any world capital. I read that as of 2024, a four-bedroom apartment could, depending on the view, set you back a cool $25 million. The big difference is that the Place des Vosges is completely landscaped in the interior and the center, complete with fountains and the statue of the king, while the Plaza Mayor is paved and mostly empty, although it does have a couple of items of interest. The plaza actually dates from the time of Philip III. History tells us that he wasn't a very good king, but his reign was distinguished by an absence of vice, which I guess is damning with faint praise. He was responsible for turning this square from an open market into kind of a Baroque plaza. Philip is memorialized in this statue shown here in the center. The square features four rather large light posts, each surrounded with a seat with brass reliefs worked into the seat backs. The reliefs tell stories about the history of Spain and of Madrid. During the Inquisition, suspected enemies of God and the state were tried here. Heretics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and for all I know to the contrary, camera-toting tourists like me. They were all guilty, of course. That had been decided in advance. They were paraded around the square and subject to all kinds of abuse before finally being executed. Some were burned. Others were slowly strangled, as you can see in the image on the left. Earlier I mentioned that the square reminds me of the Place des Vosges, originally the resort of the wealthy. These buildings serve much the same purpose. They're mainly private apartments upstairs. Philip may have planted this square close to the city's central market, but the market lives on just outside the square in the form of Mercado de San Miguel, shown here. The square might be old, but the market is practically brand new in comparison. The current building dates from 1916. In 2003, the cast iron and glass building was purchased by investors who completely renovated it. This generally isn't a good thing. The same thing happened to markets in Paris, and they were renovated and reopened at price points I could not afford. In 2010, they did reopen this market. It became Madrid's first gourmet market, and 9 years later it was actually relaunched with a number of internationally renowned chefs joining the ranks of those present. I generally enjoy city markets and make it a point not just to visit them to gawk, but mostly to pick up supplies to use in whatever kitchen apartment I happen to be staying at. This building was lovely, all glass and wrought iron, and I suppose you could do some food shopping here, but I didn't. It's much more suited for cocktails and a power lunch than for raw materials to prepare with your own hands. The facility struck me as an upscale and quite pricey combination of food court and gourmet grocery store. I finished up this part of the walk by cutting back to El Corte Inglés, the well-known Spanish department store, which has a grocery store included, much like some American Targets and Walmarts. That'll be our next stop. One thing you figure out pretty quickly when you are a solo traveler is that eating out gets old and expensive very quickly. I don't mind eating by myself in my own home or kitchen, but I really do not enjoy eating by myself in restaurants. I get too many looks, even though I'm 75 years old, and you might imagine I would be beyond that. To get around all of this, I try to stay in apartment hotels, and that is exactly what I did here in Madrid. Welcome to El Corte Inglés. It is an enormous Spanish department store chain, and in this case has its own supermarket. This was a full-service supermarket, which sold fresh fruits and vegetables, canned goods, some frozen foods, some prepared meals, and came complete with a bodega to purchase wine. I carried my haul back to the hotel and prepared a rather nice dinner for myself. Simple enough, I think, but which I thoroughly enjoyed. If memory serves, I had a second glass of the excellent local white wine. Sadly, I didn't think to photograph the bottle, so I can't buy it at home. Perhaps next time I'll remember. I hope you enjoyed your walk through two of Madrid's major squares and learning a bit about the city's history, how to navigate it, and how to keep yourself well fed, more or less on a budget. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide.